Today we're talking with Lauren Belfer, special guest author of the City of Tonawanda Public Library, which is part of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library System. Lauren is an American author who grew up in Buffalo and is well known for her debut novel, City of Light, which takes place in Buffalo, New York during the Pan-American Exposition. City of Light was a New York Times bestseller. It's been translated into 7 languages and was adapted into a stage play. Her second novel, Fierce Radiance, was published in June 2010 and is named one of the best novels of 2010 by the Washington Post and one of the year's 5 best mysteries by NPR. Welcome.
Thank you, Jill. Delighted to be here.
To start out, welcome back to Western New York for a visit. And what does the area mean to you now that you're considered one of the major, one of the country's leading authors?
Well, I always think of Western New York, as my hometown in the most profound sense, where I can go and always feel welcome and feel completely at ease, completely at home. And I've been really humbled over the years by the outpouring of affection that people in Western New York have for the novel that I wrote. I think people here were really craving for some kind of recognition of the history of the city. And, I was lucky enough to write the novel that created a real outpouring of affection, and I'm forever grateful for the city's reaction to the book.
I have noticed that many people seem to be very, almost proprietary of it a little. This is ours, this is part of us. Tell me a little bit more about how City of Light came to be.
Well, I decided to become a writer when I was 6 years old. Mm-hmm. And I started out writing short stories about princesses and about pets. Sometimes I put them together for princesses with pets. And, I did that through almost high school. And then in high school, I went to the Buffalo Seminary. I was encouraged by my teachers to begin writing poetry. And I started sending my poetry around. I got rejection letters from all the best places. And I always wanted to be a professional writer, but I wasn't really sure how to go about it. So after I got out of college, I began working at CBS News as a television journalist, starting at the bottom, first as a typist, as we were called in those days before computers, and gradually working my way up. But I always would get up really early in the morning and write fiction, work on novels. Nothing really came of them. Mm-hmm. But time passed, and I got married, and life happens to you, and I had a son. And I was lucky enough to go to the MFA program at Columbia University and learn more about the craft of writing fiction. So that is a long way of answering your question. So one day I was visiting my parents with my son, and my son was home with his grandparents, and I was wandering a little bit around the haunts of my youth, and I happened to wander into the Historical Society. And they were having an exhibit about the Pan-American Exposition and about Buffalo in 1901. And what I discovered there was astonishing to me. Buffalo was one of the great cities of America in 1901. I had no idea. And after going through the exhibit, I was walking through Delaware Park, and it just came to me like a door opening, that I had to write about the city at its moment of glory, that was the sort of task that had been given to me. And it fell together from there, piece by piece.
Well, if you're grown up wanting to be a writer, I have a pretty good idea what the next question is going to be. But did you use Buffalo and Erie County public libraries a lot when you were growing up?
Well, I used the library a lot when I was growing up, and I'll say when I was 10, 11, 12, I used to ride my bike from my family then lived on Delaware at Middlesex, and I would ride my bike down to the Hurdle Avenue branch of the public library. It's a beautiful little library. It's still there. I think it has little stained glass windows, and we drove by it this afternoon, and I always have the most wonderful memories when I drive by that library. And then when I was a little older, I used to take the bus down Delaware Avenue to the main branch of the library, where this is going to make me sound so strange, I would check out 10, 12 books at a time, mostly in history. That's what I loved to read. And I remember one summer when I was in high school and I didn't have any other plans, I set it my goal to go through the biography section, starting at the letter A and just making my way down the stacks. And I think I got through till C before the end of the summer, so I did pretty well.
What do you like to read these days then?
Well, nowadays I spend a good deal of time doing research for books in progress, and I'm very superstitious, so I can't talk about the substance of my books in progress. But I will say I do read a lot of nonfiction, still a lot of history. I try to keep up with the latest fiction, but it's a very hard thing when you're writing fiction to read fiction, and all fiction writers complain about this because one of our great joys is reading fiction, but you can only really do it between books.
I would guess have quite a bit of fondness for research, and tell me about what goes into that. And
well, I always think of research as the easy part. It's the writing and the plotting out of the books that are the most difficult part for me. I just love doing research. You can really get lost in it. And I should say that when I was researching City of Light, I made some discoveries in the local history section of the downtown branch of the library, which were astonishing to me. And I don't know if this material has been made digitally available yet, but certainly when I was researching City of Light, in the local history department, there were files and files of newspaper clippings, very lovingly bound into kind of open volumes going back to the turn of the century. And they had names like homes, museums, business leaders. So I leafed through these, for hours, reading articles about the characters in the book. You can see that this was a tremendous discovery for me, and I don't know which librarians, real heroes to me, put those volumes together. And they also had down there early telephone directories. So they're from 1900 telephone books listing the characters in the novels, where they lived, their phone numbers and their Lake Erie houses. So all these people who whose pictures I'd seen in a book, they suddenly became real. They have telephones, you could call them up. Who has their numbers now. But the library meant a tremendous amount to me, and librarians have always been my heroes because of their dedication and their passion to help the people who come in, wandering lost and looking for anything that might make a difference in their lives.
A number of, as you just said, a number of actual people from Buffalo figure prominently in City of Light. How did you go about blending these historical figures in with fictional characters?
Some people who write historical fiction only use real characters, and in a way is good because it gives you the built-in plot, which is the lives of those real people. I've never wanted to do that because I've always felt the work is more interesting to me if I have fictional characters, having the main drama of the story, so I could let them develop in any way that seems true to their characters. And then I surround my fictional creations with the real people. And it's always been a fairly seamless process for me, to put people into a community and figure out how they would interact with that pre-existing community.
So you've written about the Buffalo of the far past, and you grew up in the Buffalo of the recent past. What do you think of where the area is going now?
Oh, I've been astonished in the past 10 years to see the development in the city, in the cafes, the restaurants, the shops that are opening up. You walk along Elmwood Avenue. It's wonderful. The city of my childhood was pretty bleak. Unemployment was so high. I think there's a real sense in the air nowadays that things are happening in Buffalo and people are coming back, and the old Victorian housing stock is being renovated, and people seem so excited again about their city. It's wonderful to experience it. And I've been here during the garden walk in the summer, and people come from everywhere, and they just they can't believe how fabulous the city is, and to see all the neighborhoods that have been revitalized by the garden walk and the pride that people take in their homes nowadays. It's really wonderful, very inspiring.
You said you're a little bit superstitious, but is there anything at all you can tell us about what's next for Lauren Belfer?
No. No, but more, I don't, more seriously, I do feel superstitious, and I don't like to talk things out. And, so many people, so many well-meaning people ask me, and they're so curious, and I really appreciate it. But I'm just so scared of talking something out and not having the energy to write it.
Well, I touched a little bit on your Buffalo feels very proprietary about City of Light, but I just finished A Fierce Radiance and thought it was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Something that a lot of people don't know about penicillin back in during World War II. Tell me how you became interested in that and how that became your second novel.
I've always been interested in how new technologies affect everyday lives, and so in City of Light, I looked at hydroelectric power and how electricity transformed America. I got interested in the history of penicillin and antibiotics because my aunt, by marriage, always kept on her bureau a picture of her brother who died when he was just 11 or 12 years old from an infection that's easily curable nowadays. And she talked to me a few times about how devastated her parents were when this beautiful little boy died. He was fine one moment and the next day he was dead. And she said her mother never hugged her again. That's how traumatized the family was. And I started thinking about the shift in our conception of how life runs its course between a time when so many children would die young and a time today when it's very rare for a child to die before he or she grows up. And I wanted to look at that moment when this new technology of antibiotics came in, and as I learned more about it, I found out a lot of my preconceptions were overturned, because many people, even doctors, will say, penicillin, Alexander Fleming, late 1920s, end of story. But in fact, Alexander Fleming couldn't develop penicillin. The technology didn't exist. It wasn't until the Second World War that the technology was developed, and America really led the way. And I learned that penicillin had the same production priority as the atomic bomb, and was under the same umbrella as the development of the atomic bomb. And so when I learned that, I kind of felt the story coming together, because you have this revolutionary new technology, you have the Second World War, you have, my fictional characters living through this period, and again, I had a feeling of the door opening for me.
Okay, today I want to talk about how the city of Buffalo and Western New York shaped what became the novel City of Light. These are the towers of when I was young was called the Richardson Insane Asylum. When I was 6 and 7 years old, I lived on Richmond Avenue near Forest, so just down the street from what we then called the asylum. I saw the towers every day. My friends and I used to discuss if it was safe to play on our front lawns. And we'd warn each other that someone was watching us from those high towers with a giant telescope. you see how I grew up. It's no surprise, I guess, that I became a fiction writer. So I had this feeling that someone was watching me, and the towers haunted my dreams and nightmares all through my childhood. I was very disappointed to learn when I was researching City of Light that no one has ever lived in those towers or worked in those towers. They're just decorative, and they've been the abode for decades of pigeons. So apparently it's really disgusting up there. Next slide. This is the central terminal, and I don't know how many of you have ever actually taken a train from the central terminal. So yeah, some people, this is one of the great spaces of Western New York, and I remember going there as a child to take a train to Chicago or to New York City, and I couldn't get a good picture of it, but anyone who was there probably remembers the giant buffalo in the middle, and how people used to say, oh, I'll meet you at the buffalo, and that's how you'd meet there and go and find your train. That gave me a hint of the monumentality of this city, that this city could support a train station like that. Next. This is the old Butler mansion at the corner of Delaware and North Street. It looks beautiful now. When I was a girl, it was all boarded up and looked like a ruin. An old woman lived there, I was told, and she lived there all alone. At least that was the story, that she was living there and growing older and older behind the boarded up windows. Again, I only found out decades later that that woman was Kate Robinson Butler, the publisher of the Buffalo News, one of the great women in our history. And it sort of shows the cycle of the city, so that in the 70s, we didn't remember this. That was just an old lady growing old in a house that was falling apart around her. It's really, astonishing for me to think back on the extent to which we lost track of what this city once was. The next slide is one of the saddest memories of my youth. This is Humboldt Parkway. Shortly after it was planted, you can see the trees are still young. I'm old enough to remember Humboldt Parkway in its prime. 12 trees across, and I remember so well the sunlight glittering through that cathedral-like canopy of trees. I still get a little choked up when I think about how that parkway was destroyed to build a highway that many people feel now is absolutely useless. And I know there's a movement now in Buffalo to take down that highway and try to rebuild the Olmsted Parkway. When I became a teenager, my awareness of Buffalo's architecture shifted a little bit to this building. This is the Ellicott Square building. Incredible interior. When I was a girl, that was the location of the Department of Motor Vehicles. So, like many other teenagers, I went there to get my driver's license. I walked in and I remember thinking, wow, this is different. And I went right up to apply for my learner's permit, and I really didn't give it very much more thought. I think my reaction was, I'm sorry to say, typical of that era. Because during my youth, Buffalo was really dying. The industries were leaving town, unemployment was high, the inner city was breaking down. My friends and I spent hours talking about how we were going to leave Buffalo. We weren't raised to take pride in the city or to look back on the city's history for inspiration. As the years passed, I went to the Buffalo Seminary, I graduated, I left to go to college, and like most of my friends after college, I rarely came back to Buffalo. It's very sad for me that, when City of Light came out, I really didn't have any close friends living here anymore. So they experienced the wonderful popularity of the novel, secondhand. And as I say, I regretted that very much, that I couldn't share that with them. About 15 years after I left Buffalo, I made an astonishing discovery about the city, and it changed my opinion of my hometown forever. I was visiting Buffalo to see my parents, and I happened to wander into an exhibition at the Buffalo Historical Museum. The exhibit was about the city's history, and it focused on the city in 1901, the year of the Pan-American Exposition. What I learned going through that exhibit amazed me. I learned for the first time that 100 years ago, Buffalo was a place of immense wealth, political influence, and technological innovation. The pictures at the exhibit showed the history of the city. This is the harbor. The harbor was the greatest inland port in America in 1901. It was the commercial gateway between east and west. It was a rail hub. Its stockyards were second to none, and it was the flour capital of the world. And here's the Kellogg grain elevator. And you know, right through, I think until the last decade or so, Buffalo remained the flour capital of the world. It's just sort of shocking to think about. Hydroelectric power was being developed in Niagara Falls, and electricity was transforming the nation. The power station that you see at this lower picture, the Adams Power Station, was the first in America to use alternating current. And the ability to use alternating current is really what allowed the electrification of the country. And it also spurred many new industries like, Alcoa, these famous industries that grew up in Niagara Falls because of this access to cheap power. Western New York truly became the Silicon Valley of its day. Once there was so much wealth here, and here's another picture of the generators at the Adams Power Station. You can see how these stations work with the water going down into the turbines. So once there was so much wealth here from industry, people started bringing important architects here, and you got these incredible buildings popping up. Some of you will recognize this as the Sullivan Building downtown, which has been so beautifully renovated. Really astonishing. These are residential buildings. There were 60 millionaires in Buffalo by 1901, and this was at a time when $1 million was really a lot of money. Because of this tremendous wealth here, because of the achievement of the people who were living here, Buffalo received the honor of being chosen to host a World's Fair, which they called the Pan-American Exposition. And this is the original gateway to the exposition. If you can believe it, this gate was located at the edge of Delaware Park Lake, sort of right between the Historical Society and what is now the Art Gallery. That's what it looked like. Really amazing. Here's another view of the Pan-American Exposition, looking toward Delaware Park. And this beautiful poster that they made. I just love that, because some of those people could be characters in City of Life. The exhibit I saw that day at the Historical Society struck me with the force, really, of a revelation. After going through the exhibit, I went for a walk in Delaware Park. This is what the park looked like in 1901. At this point in my life, I should tell you, I'd had several short stories published and some essays and reviews published here and there. I had decided to become a writer when I was 6 years old. My first efforts were short stories about animals, my pets. about princesses. Sometimes I combine these things into short stories about princesses and their pets. I went to high school at the Buffalo Seminary, as I said, and my teachers there encouraged me to start writing poetry, and I sent poetry out to magazines. I collected rejection letters from all the best places all around the country. In fact, I had a very long road to publishing success. My first short story was published when I was well into adulthood. It was published after 43 rejections. The second short story that I had published was much more successful. It was published after only 27 rejections. But through this process, I never gave up. Of course, this was something I learned from growing up in Western New York. We never give up. We keep going. So I just kept going. Getting stories rejected, putting them into a new envelope, sending them out again, getting them rejected again. That was my job, And then finally it paid off. So at the point that I had wandered into the Historical Society, I'd been searching for a topic for a novel. I wanted to write a novel that would show the broad sweep of history played out through everyday lives. To me, fiction is by far the best medium for exploring the interaction between society and the individual. So that day, after touring the museum, I sat down at a bench at the edge of the lake, and that was my view, right there. I visited the Park Lake many times in my childhood, and in those days it was filled with garbage and covered in grease. But after a recent cleanup, it was beautiful. When I came out to the park, it was gorgeous as it must have been, I thought, a century ago during the Pan-American Exposition. I stared into the still water, which revealed a perfect reflection of the clouds in the sky. And then all at once, in a moment of insight, I saw the novel that I had to write. I had to tell the story of my city. I had to paint its portrait at its moment of glory. I had to resurrect its history, bring its past to life. But the question that I had to ask myself was, how do I break into this story? Where do I begin? And it seemed, at least, with the exhibition so clear in my mind, that I should set the novel in 1901. Begin with the beginning of the Pan-American Exposition and culminate in the death of President McKinley. A novel needs a very clear structure and very clear plot line. And I thought that the course of the exposition would provide a kind of natural narrative structure. I suddenly felt a kind of personal responsibility to tell my city, the history of my city, a kind of responsibility to the city itself. Well, right then and there, on the shores of the lake, the demons who plague all fiction writers came to me and said, "Don't be ridiculous. You can't write a novel like that. You're not capable of writing a novel like that. And besides, who are you going to get to narrate a novel like that?" And then in another moment of insight, so that's two in one day, I had the answer for the demons, and I knew who my narrator would be. Up the street from Delaware Park on Bidwell Parkway was the high school I had attended, the Buffalo Seminary. When I was a student at SEM, I'd heard stories about the legendary headmistresses in the school's history and the power that these women had held in the community. And I thought that a woman like that would be an ideal narrator for the book. But then the demons returned and said, "An unmarried professional woman, an old-fashioned headmistress? Are you crazy? Such a woman would be too prudish to narrate a novel like this. And no reader would want to spend 500 pages with a person like that." And so I realized that the headmistress who narrated my book would only appear to be a prudish blue stocking. In reality, she would have given birth to a child. Her past would be hidden, and her life would be governed and ruled by all that she had to conceal and protect. So the next day, I returned home to New York, and I began to research and outline the novel. Immediately, I learned how important Buffalo was in 1901 because the libraries in New York City were bursting with information about Buffalo. This in itself shocked me because I was accustomed to a city that was the butt of jokes wherever I went around the country. You tell someone you're from Buffalo, they would make fun of you. I don't think that happens anymore, I'm happy to say. But in the libraries of New York, I found 19th century guidebooks to the city. I found newspaper clippings about all manner of important events that had taken place here. I found collections of photographs of the Olmsted Parkways and of Delaware Park. Among the most useful books I found in the libraries of New York City were books of photos of great Buffalonians of 1901. And I used these photos as I began to write the novel to gain insight into the characters of the real people I was writing about. So here are two. We have Ainsley Wilcox, one of the great business leaders of the city. It was in his home that Theodore Roosevelt was inaugurated after the death of McKinley. And on the other side is Mariah Love, from one of the wealthiest families of the city. She became an extraordinary philanthropist here and really did a lot to transform the city. It used to be said that if she had been a man, she could have run for president. But there were such limits to what a woman could do in those days. So she had a kind of presidency of philanthropy, I like to think of it. Here's Dexter Rumsey, who became one of the main characters in the book, and John Albright, who of course founded the Albright Knox Art Gallery. He was the equivalent of, Bill Gates is today. He, I believe, received a quarter for every ton of coal that went through Buffalo, and a lot of coal went through Buffalo. He was a very wealthy man. And here's Grover Cleveland and his wife, the young Frances Folsom. She had been his ward, and he had pushed her baby carriage down Delaware Avenue when she was born. It was a very unusual relationship, I believe. In order to capture what these people must really have been like and the world they lived in, I began to read memoirs, collections of letters, newspapers, magazines, everything I could find from that era. I wanted to get beyond the filter of history. I wanted to put myself in the shoes of my characters as they were living their lives, before they knew what would happen, before we knew how things would turn out. I also began to read the novels of that era, particularly the work of Henry James and Edith Wharton. The thing I learned from the novels, which really surprised me, were the modes of address that people used to talk to one another. And people in those days spoke to each other in a completely different manner than we do today when we're so relaxed about things. You could identify someone's social standing by the way other people address them. And so in City of Light, you may have noticed everyone calls Mr. Rumsey, Mr. Rumsey. That is the sign that he is at the top of the social scale. So even people who are as wealthy as him still call him Mr. He's at the top. Men who are equal call each other by their last names. So Tom Sinclair calls, Albright, and so on. Those people are equal. They all call Mr. Rumsey, Mr. Rumsey. And you can follow through the entire society based on these gradations of who's permitted to call someone by a first name. Among women, do they ever call each other first names in public? Often even siblings female siblings call each other by their married names in public and only use first names in private. So once I put this layer of formal address into the novel, I immediately felt myself standing up straighter, as if I were dressed in the clothes of that time. I was really there, living the novel with the characters. I decided in City of Light to blend real people with fictional people and to make my fictional characters the center of the book. People write historical fiction in a lot of different ways, and many novels, especially nowadays, only have historical figures and follow the fates of those historical figures. I wanted my main characters to be fictional because it seems to me you can get more involved in their lives, and I could let their characters develop in any way I chose and create their fates rather than having to follow the predetermined fates of real people. So as I conjured up all these people, the real people and my fictional creations, into a story, I began to put these people into my city, to put them into the beautiful office buildings and into the homes, into the parks and on the streets, even into the cemetery of my hometown. And I gradually had a wonderful feeling of the city itself becoming a character in the novel. Then I came back to Buffalo for many research trips, walking the streets of the city, visiting the cemetery, making lots of notes on the things I discovered. I was amazed to discover the local history room at the downtown library, where they had telephone directories from 1901. And so I could see the phone numbers and addresses for the real-life characters in my books. Dexter Rumsey, Bronson Ramsey, Mariah Love, John Albright. They were all listed in the phone book. Where they lived, their phone number, as if I could get on my cell phone and call them up on the telephone and talk to them. It was really a wonderful feeling. I also found extensive clipping files, that the wonderful librarians had made for over a century, with these names like Buffalo businesses, Buffalo homes, Buffalo streets. So I could begin at the beginning and see the interiors of the homes and of my characters, portrayed in the books, see pictures of their gardens, make notes, put the characters in those places that I saw because of the wonderful librarians who took the time to keep these clipping files. It was in an article about George Urban that I learned that he cultivated green roses. He was incredibly proud of these green roses. And so I had him bring a bouquet of green roses to my fictional character, Louisa Barrett, and she hated them. See, because she was a fictional character, she could have whatever reaction I wanted her to have, not what, Mariah Love might have had. And green roses are now my favorite, because then I had to find some, to see what they would look like. They're not easy to find. But it's okay, you don't have to cultivate them, I will tell you. They're not that beautiful. So I slowly found in this process that I really began to live in the city of the past. It became more real for me than the city that I grew up in. So I look at this parking lot, for example. This is the parking lot of Canisius High School on Delaware Avenue. It's really ugly, isn't it? It used to be this. There used to be a series of mansions there. This was the Milburn House in the center there where President McKinley died. So he was staying at this private home when he visited Buffalo. And he died there. It was one of a series of astonishing mansions, many of which have been turned into parking lots, like the one I just showed you. This is the Kensington Expressway. That's the Science Museum. Ahead, the Science Museum came at the end of Humboldt Parkway. What were people thinking? How did this happen? And this happened in the 60s. This neighborhood around Humboldt Parkway, it was a historic African-American community, a strongly middle and upper middle class African-American community. Unfortunately, the people there had no political clout. They couldn't save Humboldt Parkway, and it became that expressway. And it's really heartbreaking. As I continued my research, I found unexpected traces of the old city all around me, things I had never seen before. This gate is on West Ferry Street. This is the gate to the Albright Mansion. And you can see the gate. It covers the entire block. The Albright estate was vast. And parts of the gate and the wall have been taken down now, but parts of it are still there in front of the small houses. You know, the estate was sold off into small lots, and there are now several very big houses there. There are also a lot of little houses there, and almost every one has its little piece of this original stone wall, or a little gate, or a little wrought iron. And you see the old city is all around us. This is the Botanical Garden in South Park. I'd never been there when I was growing up, and my mom and I went on a research trip there one day. You know, there's a scene that takes place there at the end of the book. It's very, very beautiful. And South Park is one of the Olmsted parks. So his park system in Buffalo was vast. You know, it was the largest park system of any city in America. This is the Coatsworth House on Cottage Street. And it just looms over the other buildings in the neighborhood. I remember very well the day that I went to find it, because I knew it was there. I wanted to see it. I had my son with me. He was about 6 years old then. So we drive up. You know, there it is. It was incredible to see it. And there was a moving van outside. And my son said, who knows me very well, he said, "No, Mom, I know what you're thinking, and I'm not going to do it. Don't even ask me, because I'm telling you right now, I'm not getting out of this car." And, you know, my son is very counter-suggestive. He always has. So I said, "Okay, honey, suit yourself." But I knew he would never stay in the car. And of course, I never would have let him stay in the car. So I got out of the car, and naturally, he got out of the car. And I went up to the moving man, and I said, "Gee, can I go in and look at the house?" And the moving man said, "Oh, you have to ask the lady over there." So there's this lovely young lady. And she said, "Oh, sure, come up. I just live on the top floor. I'm moving in today." So the moving man gave my son a little box to carry, and up we went to the top floor. And, you know, it was completely preserved. That was the ballroom of the Coatsworth House. And you can see it's these windows up here, and then a separate staircase that led to the tower. You could see the lake from there. It was so beautiful, and I decided, okay, I have to have a scene in my novel to take place there, and my fictional character, Francesca Coatsworth, uses that floor as her architecture studio. So it was really, you know, such a wonderful bit of serendipity that I wound up there. So gradually, I felt that City of Light, the novel, became the story of two cities. It became the story of the old city, but also the story of the city I grew up in the 70s. You know, the city that I grew up in was economically depressed and offered only very limited options to young people. But the old city, that city, was one of the great cities of America. And so when I wrote City of Light, yes, it takes place in 1901, but it was always written in a kind of reflection of the city I grew up in. You know, to say, this was the city of the past, this is the city of today. The two things are like this in the novel, even though the city of the 70s is never mentioned. Even the title of the book addresses, you know, this kind of paradox, because Buffalo was indeed called the City of Light in 1901. It wasn't Paris, it was Buffalo. I think we have time. I'd like to read to you a short section from the book, just the opening, and then a little bit about Tonawanda. So, this is from the very opening of the book. Louisa Barrett is sitting in her salon, where she is entertaining the people of the city, and thinking about everything that's going on as the people start planning the Pan-American Exposition. In the past 2 years, the stream of visitors to my salon had become ever more fascinating. Buffalo was to be an exposition city now, in the tradition of Philadelphia and Chicago. Most important, the Pan Am's very existence symbolized and confirmed Buffalo's vital place in the United States. The exposition site was less than a mile from my home, and over 8 million people from around the country and around the world would have expected to visit Buffalo during the coming summer. Debates about lighting, coloring, and schematic statuary took place before my fire, the gentlemen tapping their pipes against the mantel. Sometimes they called my gatherings a saloon instead of a salon, as if they were visiting the Wild West and I were Annie Oakley. I tried not to show them how much their teasing pleased me. But on this particular Monday evening in March, I sent my visitors away by 7. There was a wet snow falling and a chill dampness in the air that made me want to be alone in front of the fire. My guests grumbled half-heartedly, though some of them were privately grateful, no doubt, to return home. Here on the shores of Lake Erie, we respected the icy storms of early spring. After everyone was gone, I sat in my rocking chair, resting my head and luxuriating in the evening. And then in the quiet, I heard my favorite sound, sleigh bells jingling on harnesses as the horses trotted down Bidwell Parkway, sleigh gliders swishing through the snow. At this hour, bejeweled couples cloaked in fur against the cold were on their way to dinner parties. Snowstorms were never permitted to interfere with the social swirl. Closing my eyes, I conjured a scene in my mind. A dining room with French doors and a coffered ceiling, a long table laid for 12, with freshly polished silver and candlelight throwing rainbows through the crystal. I was forever apart from that life, observing it, never living it. Nonetheless, I pictured myself reclining on a sleigh, the harness bells dancing, a bison skin pulled around me for warmth, as snowflakes touched my face, and the sleigh carried me to dinner at the estate of John J. Albright or Dexter P. Rumsey. And I'll read a very short passage from the end of the book. So for those of you who haven't read the book, I won't give any background except to say that Louisa Barrett is in a carriage coming back to Buffalo from Niagara Falls at night. And she says, "We took the river road along the Erie Canal and the Niagara River. The pear orchards of the Tonawanda surrounded us, the fruit ripening, its weight pulling down the branches. 100,000 pear trees grew here. The air was heavy with their scent. I opened my eyes and gazed out the window. Moonlight on water, pear trees as far as I could see, and nothing else, no one else." That was the Tonawandas 100 years ago. So here's Buffalo today. And I just want to say in conclusion, in the past decade or so, I've really noticed something remarkable happening in Buffalo. The city has changed. The city is changing every day. Nowadays, I think the spirit of Buffalo has much more in common with the city of 1901 than it does with the blighted city I grew up with during the 1970s. I see this when I walk along Elmwood Avenue. I see it on First Friday, if you walk along Allen Street and all the art galleries that have sprung up there, the museums, the new Birchfield Penny Museum, packed every weekend. So many new restaurants, so many new cafes. There's a passion and excitement in this city now that's really remarkable. And so I can only conclude by saying that, in my opinion at least, Buffalo has become the city of light once more. Thank you all for coming.